Okay, it has been several days since I started the experiment of restarting my starter. I have my Sweet Herbin Livin starter where I just used Kamut flour and water and fed my starter. And I have my Breadtopia starter where my friend sent me the starter packet. Both of them are nice and spongy. You can see the bubbles, and both of them seem to be doing about the same, in my opinion, as far as how well they are coming up as starter. And so now it's time to see how they do in bread. So the idea here is to keep things as similar as possible. Since I'm using just Kamut flour, I want to use just a recipe that is only Kamut flour. And the recipe I found for that, if you've seen my other videos, is the Rose Homestead. So Mary at the Rose Homestead has a beautiful video on using Kamut flour, and that's where I got this from. And I've had really good bread from her, but I've always wanted a bit bigger rise. And so I've been playing with, is my sourdough starter spongy enough? It was too thin. I realized that as I'm learning, I'm going, boy, it was thin. I was adding too much water. I don't think the equal measure flour, equal measure water based on volume is right. I think it's better based on weight. And I did learn that from Breadtopia and other places. I also have learned things from the Perfect Loaf. And what we're doing here today is we're making sourdough bread. And the Rose Homestead, Mary's recipe, the amount is just for one loaf. So I'm going to make one loaf for the Sweet Herbin Livin starter, one loaf with the Breadtopia starter, and let's just see how they do. So let's start with the Breadtopia first, and we're going to take 1 1/3 cups of water, and 1/2 cup of our sourdough starter, which is so nice and spongy. You can see the bubbles. So I did not get any hooch at all when I was feeding either one of these. The way that we measure based on volume is not as precise. So what I'm actually doing here is I'm going to weigh this, make sure it's on grams. And that will include the bowl, but I need a little bit more, and that way when I can see a very faint line. A groove in the bowl. And it's measuring 1/2 cup. Rose Homestead says use 1/2 cup. So what I'm going to do is my measure for this, including the bowl, so that's my tare, is 231 grams. So I'm going to put this in here. And so as to not taint the results, I'm going to go rinse this out so there is no starter from the Breadtopia that will be in the Sweet Herbin Livin. It's just called Sweet Herbin Livin because I made it from scratch, and it's the Kamut flour and the water. That's it. Theirs is from wheat flour, and they have collected the yeast and dried it. So here I'm just stirring that in. All right. Now we will take 1 1/3 cups of water, and we'll do the same thing we did before. We're going to do 1/2 cup, but I will put it on. I'll put it on my scale so that I'm getting, and look at that, nice and bubbled. I'm going to get the same measure by weight, not just relying on the measure by volume. That's what I'm hoping anyway. The best laid plans. Okay, and that's the thing is, there's so much. I have to stand on my tippy toes to see. And I wanted 231, and I'm not getting that. By volume, it's half a cup. By weight, it's 176. By weight, that was 231. So that's why we see I'm going, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it this way. Okay, does that mean that that's going to make a lighter loaf? I don't know. I'm not going to go beyond the half cup because that's what the Rose Homestead calls for. So let's put it in. And there, we may have just discovered why it's so important to use weight rather than volume. Because that's a big difference. 176 to 231. That's a big difference. So following the recipe, we use 1 1/3 cups of water, 1/2 cup of sourdough starter. Then we do 1 1/2 teaspoons of salt and 3 1/2 cups of Kamut flour. You combine it together and allow it to rest for 30 minutes to an hour. So part of me is sitting here going, oh, just leave the salt out until no, we're not gonna mess with the recipe. We're gonna follow it just as it says. So 1 1/2 teaspoons of salt. I'm using Celtic salt here. So that's 1. I like Celtic salt. I also like Himalayan salt. I'm using Celtic salt. It has more minerals than the Himalayan salt. So all right, so we've got our salt in, and then it calls for 3 cups. I'm going to start with Breadtopia. So 1, 2, 3, and this is one of those times when I wish I had 2 sourdough whisks, because after I mix this together, so you can see it, mixing it together. Need an overhead camera view, don't I? Then it calls for that last half cup of flour. So we're going to add that in. Okay, I'm at the point now where I need to use my hands. And yeah, we need to get the flour at the bottom. There's flour at the bottom still, and so I'm trying to work that in. All right, so I've got that worked in. Okay, so I used half a cup of sourdough starter. Everything else has been, I can say, pretty much the same, because but when I measured out and by volume, I used half a cup. When I put it on the scale, my sourdough starter and measured the Breadtopia, it was 231 grams. When I put the half a cup of sourdough starter on the scale that was my own from scratch, it was 176. So this actually feels moister, more moist than the Breadtopia. Since I'm still such a newbie to sourdough, I don't actually know what that means, but I have a nice ball. It's nice and moist. I have bread covers, bowl covers. I'm going to cover both. And the instructions on the whole grain Kamut sourdough bread from the Rose Homestead is now to cover and let it rest for 30 minutes to an hour. And since I made some fantastic sourdough pancake mix using the sourdough discard, I'm going to go have breakfast now. This will be our first stretch and fold. This does seem very dry, but we're going to follow Mary's suggestion from the Rose Homestead, and we're going to gently pinch so that we don't overwork. She was telling us in the video I watched, and I think it's an updated video that she did on her Kamut flour. I will link that below. And she was telling us, about how the Kamut flour as an ancient grain, it is different from our modern flours. And I totally agree with that. And how we need to be gentle with it. It doesn't take the same autolyse process that our modern day flours take. And so we don't want to have the same kind of fermenting and autolyse process and all that. Okay, so we did that. I think I did that 5 times instead of 4. We're going to cover it up. Next, we're going to move to the Sweet Herbin Livin starter. This one seemed more moist from the beginning. Yeah, it still does seem more moist. Still want to wet my hands, and we're going to do the same thing where we gently pinch. Okay, so for the next 2 hours, I'm going to do a stretch and fold. Gentle stretch and folds for my Kamut flour sourdough. Okay, so I have my dough out of the fridge, and the first one we're going to do in the oval shaped Banneton is our Breadtopia. They both look. Mr. Sweet's sitting over in the wings. It is summer in Georgia, and that means the temperature outside is hot and it is humid. And so he has, what kind of grill do you have?
Pellet smoker.
He's got his pellet smoker, and we are actually going to bake our bread out in the pellet smoker rather than heating up our house. So the first one on the green tray, Breadtopia. Then we have our dough from the completely from scratch, what I'm calling the Sweet Herbin Livin sourdough starter. Brush that off, so I'm going to clean that up. And we'll score this. That didn't score quite as pretty as the other one did. And I can feel this one spreading out. We'll just see what that means. We're not making assumptions. We're just going to see what it means when we get there. So we're going to take these out. The Dutch ovens are already preheating out in the pellet stove. The pellet stove? Pellet smoker.
Stove works.
Pellet stove works. All right, we're going to carry these out and get them going. So here we go. Here's our Pit Boss pellet smoker. Mr. Sweet loves to grill.
one do you want to put that one?
It doesn't move. Left is fine. So the Breadtopia is going in the.
Does it just lift up? And
yeah, just lift up and put it in. Yep.
Do I get any credit for that?
You get all kinds of credit. All right. And then we have a second Dutch oven or Dutch skillet. It's not really an oven. But 2 skillets. So you got to be really careful because these things are super hot. All right. And we're going to set the timer for 20 minutes and then come take the lids off. All right, it is the end of the day and we have baked. Let's get this off the wrapper. That's so loud. We have baked our bread with the sourdough starter that I made from scratch. And we have baked the bread from the Utopia. Both of them. This seems to have risen a little bit higher than the one I did. And I may have not let it prove enough. Either one of them. They're both very dense. I didn't make the levain this time because Rose Homestead doesn't make the levain, so I didn't make the levain. Let's see what they taste. I'm going to just cut a little slice off. Very good. It's got a sour taste to it. This one doesn't have quite, I don't know. Mr. Sweet's not in the shot. All right. Mr. Sweet just tasted the Sweet Herbin Livin. Now he's tasting the, what do you think? I think this one had a little bit more sour taste to it.
I think so. Mm-hmm. I got it at the end.
Yeah. So the Breadtopia has a little bit more sour flavor to it. The crumb, there's not really a lot of open. It actually looks like the Sweet Herbin Livin has more openings in the crumb. So I think I'm sitting here going, I'm happy with the flavor. Flavor's good. I think we're going to have excellent bread. It didn't overcook the bottom on either one of them, so that's good. I think I've just got to, next time I make the Sweet Herbin Livin, I'm going to weigh out my sourdough starter rather than using the measuring cup, because we can see that this one didn't rise as high as this one. So the measuring cup itself is measuring at 78 grams. So 231 minus 78, and then I think it was 176 minus, so I did 100 grams of sourdough starter in the Sweet Herbin Livin loaf, and 231 minus 78, that's 150 grams, give or take. Doing the math. Mr. Sweet is just over there laughing at me. He is not helping me. Anyway, that just made me go, okay, I definitely want to make sure I measure my sourdough starter. You know, sourdough is all the rage these days. I am enjoying my Kamut sourdough bread. Mr. Sweet loves the Kamut sourdough bread. And I think it's one of those, it's just a bonus to us that we can have bread and feel good because it's a fermented bread and have ancient grain and still get to enjoy bread without having the aches and pains and the weight gain and things like that. I'm going to keep working on my sourdough bread because I do want it to rise a little bit more, but working with ancient grains is different. And I've watched the Rose Homestead video and her bread rises, so I have great hope that I'm going to be able to get my bread to rise as well. Comparing the Breadtopia with the Sweet Urban Livin, whether you're buying a packaged starter because you're not having success with your sourdough starter or you're just not confident, I would go ahead and do either one. I feel like it's just getting the right texture. We wanted to make sure it's a spongy texture, and you could tell there was a difference between the Sweet Urban Livin and the Breadtopia. The Breadtopia seems to have made a higher rise, but not as big of a crumb.